The train moved steadily through the mountains, its iron wheels grinding against the frost-covered tracks, echoing faintly into the void beyond the tunnels. The wind outside screamed across the peaks, carrying with it the smell of snow and cold earth. Inside, the compartments were dimly lit by flickering lamps, casting long shadows across the weary faces of the few passengers who had braved the night. Their silence was absolute, punctuated only by the rhythmic clatter of the train and the occasional sigh of the draft slipping through the sealed doors. The passengers seemed detached, each lost in their own thoughts, oblivious to the sense of unease that had begun to creep into the air. A man, seated near the rear, had a small leather case chained to his wrist. He kept it on his lap, eyes darting to every passing shadow outside the window. Occasionally, his fingers brushed over the cold steel of the chains, tightening them with subtle urgency. He did not speak to anyone, and when others glanced toward him, he averted his eyes, leaving a lingering tension in the compartment. The train rumbled through narrow curves and sharp inclines, the metal groaning under the strain of the snow-laden tracks, as if protesting against its burden. The landscape outside was a blurred panorama of snow, rock, and skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the gray sky. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the world bathed in a dim, suffocating darkness. Occasionally, a gust of wind would sweep through an open vent, carrying with it a scent that was not quite snow nor earth, but something older, more primal. A faint rustling came from the undercarriage, and some passengers, glancing downward, noted nothing. Yet the sound persisted, subtle, rhythmic, almost deliberate. The train entered a tunnel carved through a jagged ridge. Darkness consumed the windows, and the lamplight flickered in protest, revealing glimpses of faces etched with quiet dread. The man with the case shifted uneasily, his eyes narrowing as if tracking something invisible. Something moved in the shadows of the tunnel, and for a moment, the train seemed to hold its breath. A low, guttural sound reverberated through the metal walls, a growl that resonated too deeply to belong to any ordinary animal. The passengers tensed, a collective instinct sensing danger, though none knew its shape. The train slowed as it approached a curve within the tunnel. The man with the chained case rose, glancing at the others, yet not speaking, as if acknowledging the unspoken truth that had begun to settle over the carriage. His hand hovered over the latch of the case. A sudden clatter from the roof of the compartment caused a shiver to pass through the passengers. Shadows shifted unnaturally along the walls, elongated and warped. The growl had grown louder, a rolling vibration that seemed to seep into the very floorboards. The metal chains of the case rattled. The man's jaw tightened, his movements deliberate and precise. A loud bang echoed through the tunnel as the train's wheels hit an uneven section of track. The light flickered violently, revealing, for a fraction of a second, a silhouette pressed against the window, hunched, muscular, and unmistakably humanoid, yet wrong in proportion. The passengers froze. The man with the case exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening the chain, as if to restrain not a thing, but a force that could not be contained. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving a silence more profound than the one before. The train began to accelerate once more, and yet the sense of being watched did not diminish. Eyes invisible, ancient, and relentless seemed to follow every movement, every anxious breath. Snow began to drift into the tunnel, carried by a wind that should not have reached so far underground. The train entered another curve, and a section of the floorboards groaned under a weight unseen. The passengers remained seated, some pressed against the windows, some gripping the edges of their seats, yet none dared speak. Their fear was collective, unspoken, as if acknowledging a presence that existed beyond understanding. The man with the case moved to the door at the rear of the carriage, his hands fumbling with the lock. The train began to shudder violently, the metal rails vibrating as if in protest. From the darkness ahead, a low, resonant howl erupted, carrying the sound of something immense and predatory. It was close, impossibly close. The passengers instinctively shrank back, pressed against walls and each other. The growl escalated, shifting into a series of snarls and guttural clicks, rhythmic, deliberate, intelligent. The air grew heavier, carrying the faint stench of iron and something wild, primal, and alive. The train's wheels screeched around a bend. The steel rails twisted and pounded under the force of momentum. Outside, a massive figure leapt from ridge to ridge, tracking the train with unerring accuracy. Inside, the lamps flickered and dimmed, plunging the carriages into near darkness. The man with the case struggled with the latch, sweat dripping down his temple, his movements tense and purposeful. Behind him, the shadow seemed to twist, stretching toward him in impossible angles. The passengers could feel the vibrations of immense claws against the metal undercarriage, the pulse of a creature following every motion, every decision. Minutes passed as the train barreled through the night. The growls had become intermittent, almost taunting, yet no one dared look. The wind whistled through the gaps in the carriages, carrying whispers that sounded like voices half remembered, echoes of something lost in the mountains long before the tracks had been laid. The man with the case finally secured it, a shudder running through him as he exhaled. He returned to his seat, eyes fixed forward, knowing that something had shifted, something had been released. The train emerged from the tunnel into an open stretch, the moon briefly illuminating the snow-covered landscape. For a moment, it seemed the danger had passed, yet the distant howl returned, closer and impossibly precise. It carried over the mountains, bouncing from ridge to ridge, following the train as if tracking it personally. The passengers looked at one another, understanding without words that the journey had changed. They were no longer merely passengers. They were prey, observed, and the rules of the world outside no longer applied. The train continued on, the rhythmic clatter of wheels masking the faint padding of something running parallel, unseen. The man with the case did not speak, did not move. The shadows in the compartments lengthened unnaturally with the motion of the train, curling along walls and ceilings in ways that defied logic. The wind outside carried the faint, metallic scent of blood and the sharp temps of fear. The growl had subsided into a whisper, but it was there, always there, waiting. As the night deepened, the snow thickened, and the mountains became nothing but white shapes in the distance. The train's path forward seemed endless. The passengers remained silent, their eyes fixed on the dimly lit corridors, aware that the line between hunter and hunted had been erased. The case remained chained to the man's wrist, its contents unknown, yet everyone sensed its significance. The train moved forward, carrying them deeper into the mountains, and into a darkness that seemed almost alive. There were no further incidents, no obvious attacks, but the air was heavy, charged, and impossible to ignore. Every shadow in the compartments seemed to twitch with hidden purpose. Every gust of wind carried a hint of motion that should not have been. The train rattled along the tracks, the passengers trapped in a rhythm they could not break, aware that something relentless was following them, but never fully revealing itself. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to touch the peaks, the train had passed through miles of wilderness. The tracks stretched forward, disappearing into fog and snow. Outside, the world appeared calm, untouched, yet the presence remained, just beyond perception. The man with the case stared forward, eyes hollow, unblinking. The passengers remained silent, their faces pale, knowing without question that the journey had changed everything. What had been unleashed could not be undone. What hunted them was patient, intelligent, and eternal. The train disappeared into the horizon, leaving only the faint echo of iron against stone. Behind it, the mountains remained, silent and indifferent, but for the occasional sound of a low, resonant growl carried on the wind. The story did not end. The watchers, the hunted, and the shadows persisted, and the last journey of the mountain train would be remembered only as a passage into something far older than human understanding, a darkness that followed without pause, without mercy, and without end. The village lay hidden in the folds of the mountains, surrounded by dense forest and the shadow of jagged cliffs. The air was damp, carrying the scent of moss, decaying leaves, and something older, a faint undertone of iron and earth. A narrow path led to the village, barely wide enough for a single cart, and snow had begun to fall in thin, silent flakes. The houses were built of timber and stone, their roofs heavy with moss, windows darkened by thick curtains. From a distance, the settlement appeared empty, yet a subtle movement suggested life within. A young anthropologist arrived in the late afternoon, her notebook in hand, intending to observe the village's preparations for the upcoming harvest festival. She noticed the villagers moving with deliberate precision, arranging objects in the square, lighting small fires, and marking symbols on doors and walls. They acknowledged her presence with cautious smiles, nods that did not reach their eyes. There was an unspoken tension, a rhythm to their movements that suggested not hospitality, but anticipation. The anthropologist followed, documenting everything, unaware that she was stepping into a space where observation itself would be tested. As twilight approached, the village square transformed. Torches were lit along the perimeter, flickering in the windless evening. Wooden effigies were placed strategically around the space, carved with faces that seemed almost human, twisted in expressions of pain or ecstasy. The anthropologist noted the patterns carefully, sketching each detail, yet an unease began to settle in her chest. She realized that the villagers did not move randomly. Each placement of objects, each gesture, carried intent beyond explanation. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the stone paths, as though reacting to the torchlight, writhing in silent animation. The villagers gathered in a circle, chanting quietly, their voices low and resonant, blending with the natural sounds of the forest. The anthropologist recorded the shapes of their hands, the positions of their bodies, the cadence of their rhythm. The moon rose, unseen at first, behind thick clouds, then partially visible, casting a pale, silver light that washed over the village. The shadows deepened, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Though the anthropologist noted no wind or precipitation, the sense of observation turned into a sensation of being observed, a creeping awareness that something ancient and aware was present in the circle. She stepped closer, notebook in hand, trying to remain unobtrusive. Yet the village seemed to respond to her intrusion. Symbols she had thought were static now seemed to shift in subtle ways, lines bending at angles impossible to trace, marks darkening where her gaze lingered. Small animals in the vicinity, birds, squirrels, vanished, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against the ears. The chanting intensified, not louder, but denser, resonating within the bones, as if the forest itself had joined in. The anthropologist observed a central figure among the villagers, standing on a raised platform, hooded, anonymous, yet commanding every movement around. The figure held a staff, intricately carved, the designs of which seemed to writhe under the moonlight. The anthropologist noted the hands of the villagers, raised now in unison, fingers splayed in gestures that felt like a language older than speech. There was no fear yet, only fascination mixed with an unsteady awareness of crossing boundaries, stepping into knowledge that was never meant to be observed. The clouds parted slightly, revealing the full moon in its brilliance. The village seemed to respond instantly. Shadows elongated impossibly, twisting across the square, converging toward the central figure. The chanting became a low hum, a vibration felt in the chest more than heard with the ears. The anthropologist froze, the notebook forgotten, as a shape emerged behind the platform. Indistinct at first, but gradually assuming a form that defied human understanding. Muscular, hunched, with the elongated limbs of predatory power. The figure moved with deliberate, silent intent. It observed, as though aware of the observers, calculating, patient. The villagers did not react to the creature in any conventional sense. Their movements became more precise, their gestures more synchronized. It was as if the presence of the entity was anticipated, requiem eben, for the ritual to reach its completion. The anthropologist realized that she had been mistaken in her initial assumptions. This was no harvest festival. It was a ceremonial invocation, a preparation for transformation, and she had been included simply by proximity, her observation sealing her place in the unfolding sequence. The full moon illuminated every detail. The central figure raised the staff, and the shadows responded, coiling and shifting like liquid. The humanoid form advanced subtly, moving between trees and structures with impossibly silent steps. The villagers continued their rhythm, chanting and gesturing, a collective motion that seemed to merge with the very fabric of the forest. The anthropologist took a cautious step backward, but the ground beneath her seemed to pulse with the cadence of the ritual. Her heartbeat accelerated in a way that synchronized with the hum of the chanting, a physical connection she could not ignore. As the night deepened, the humanoid form approached the village square fully, now fully visible under the silver light of the moon. Its eyes glinted with intelligence, predatory awareness, and an unsettling recognition of her presence. The anthropologist felt an instinctive terror, not born of immediate threat, but of inevitability. This was not an attack, this was acknowledgement. The ritual had reached the threshold, and she had crossed it merely by standing too close. She turned to leave, notebook clutched, but the village paths seemed to twist, bending unnaturally, preventing a clear exit. Every turn led back to the square. The villagers continued, unyielding, their focus entirely on the ritual. The humanoid creature observed, motionless now, its presence a silent verdict. The anthropologist understood that what would unfold next was beyond observation, beyond documentation, a threshold she had trespassed. The forest, the village, and the moon were aligned in a pattern she could not decipher fully, but she felt its consequences intimately. Or spacet. Though time seemed suspended, the humanoid figure began to circle the platform, moving in harmony with the villagers' gestures. Each movement seemed to pulse through the forest itself, vibrating along the roots and stones, carrying a sense of transformation. The anthropologist, trapped by a combination of fear and fascination, realized that the ritual's purpose was not merely ceremonial, but functional. A conduit, a moment of change dictated by the rhythms of the moon and the collective will of the villagers. The shadows shifted once more, stretching toward her. The air grew thick, charged with the sensation of potential, of an outcome suspended. The villagers did not notice her fully. She was both present and absent, a witness whose role was now irrevocable. The humanoid form paused, studying her with eyes that seemed to pierce both flesh and thought. She could not look away, yet movement was impossible. The ritual continued in deliberate, slow progression, its meaning inaccessible, yet its force undeniable. As the first gray light of dawn approached, the moon still hung high, silver and unyielding. The villagers' motions slowed, but the humanoid form lingered at the edge of the square, watching. The anthropologist realized that her presence had become part of the sequence. She was not attacked. Not yet. But neither was she free. The forest and the village seemed to breathe in unison, carrying the knowledge that some things had been set in motion that could not be reversed. Eventually, the chanting ceased. Silence returned, but it was not ordinary silence. The air retained a weight, a subtle vibration of something ancient, patient, and observant. The humanoid form melted into the shadows, leaving behind a sense of unfinished purpose. The anthropologist was left standing in the village square, notebook in hand, aware that she had witnessed something forbidden, something older than comprehension. The paths to the edge of the forest now appeared, yet they no longer seemed entirely real, as if leading not just out, but into something else entirely. The ritual was complete, yet incomplete. The villagers dispersed silently, their faces unreadable, the humanoid form gone but lingering in memory. The anthropologist moved slowly, every step cautious, knowing she had become part of an event that would haunt the boundaries of reason. The forest loomed around her, the first light of day casting deceptive warmth over the trees and snow. She would leave, eventually, but the presence followed invisibly. The ritual unbroken in its purpose, a cycle waiting to continue, patient and inevitable. The full moon had passed, yet its influence remained, tangible in the air, perceptible in the heartbeat of the forest. And the anthropologist understood, with a clarity that chilled, that the night's events were only a prelude. What had been called forth would return, always returning, tied inexorably to the rhythm of the moon, to the forest and to the village that waited silently for its next witness.